Welcome back to my third video in the series covering the 2022 Wingman Challenge, an 1,100-mile unsupported paramotor adventure challenge from Lake Tahoe, California to Apple Valley, Utah. To recap where we left off, myself and three other pilots, John, Joe, and Chuck, all flew several miles to the southeast of Hurricane, Utah, where we decided to do some fly camping up on an isolated plateau. We woke up to a beautiful sunrise at our campsite, and as we were packing up all of our things into our kit to be able to fly away with later, we started planning out what the next step in our route would look like. Our ultimate goal, the Cougar Ridge Ranch, was approximately 133 miles still to our northeast, but we weren't able to make a direct flight there because of sheer terrain, a lot of 10,000-foot mountain ranges, as well as a lack of gas stops, just preventing us from making that kind of distance. So instead, the route we came up with was to fly to the north, to an airport called Parowan where we knew we could get gas, and then we would fly east where we would sleep for the night and hopefully try to get a top up on our tanks, before the next morning traveling the rest of the total 190 miles we would need to be able to get to our final destination. With our general plan in mind, we began looking in detail at our next flight, which is going to be a 70-mile stretch from our campsite almost directly north along the western edge of the Zion National Park to Parowan Airport, which we knew had gas looking at the airspace map. We were all a bit anxious as we were getting ready to take off though. Conditions were interesting. There was a very slight 1 to 2 mile an hour wind coming down from the hill behind us, so we had to choose between either launching uphill into a very mild wind or launching downwind but also running downhill. Either way, the stakes were high. A failed launch with broken gear would leave us stranded, with a several-mile hike to the nearest place we could possibly or reasonably expect a vehicle to be able to access to pick us up. Joe was the bravest of us and the most anxious to get into the skies. He was the first one to attempt a launch. Fortunately, he didn't break any gear, and the lesson that he learned for all of us taught us that the downhill, downwind approach is going to be the best bet. So we all lined up to launch. Knowing that I had the best fuel economy, I launched first, followed shortly by John, then Joe, and finally Chuck. I loitered in the area to make sure everyone got off the ground safely, and once they did, we pressed on towards our destination. Once we got in the air, the flight was relatively uneventful, but stunningly beautiful. So I'll just leave you with a few short clips. Aside from managing our fuel economy, the only technical part of this flight, as we neared our destination, was navigating around the Cedar City Class E surface airspace. This would push us to the east into some pretty high terrain that we had to climb over, mostly to get out of the rotor that was coming off of the tops of these 10,000 foot mountain areas. It was certainly a bumpy ride, but at 10,000 feet it was manageable. And once we got through the worst of it, we let trims out and made it all the way to our destination at Parowan uneventfully. In the end, all 4 of us made it to the airport. For my personal stats, it covered almost exactly 70 miles in 2.5 hours, with a fuel economy of less than 3.5 liters an hour. Once we all landed at Parowan, we quickly walked over to the fuel pumps and gassed up our paramotors, then parked everything in the shade and walked a 1/4 mile to the local gas station that had a Subway inside, where we grabbed some food and sat down for a couple hours to rest and recuperate while planning our next leg. Our next flight was a relatively short and simple straight shot 37 miles from Parowan east to the Panguitch airport. However, it was dangerous in its own right because to do it we'd have to climb over 11,000 feet to cross the mountain range that separated us from our destination. Once the worst of the midday thermals had cooled off, we lined up and launched and began the long climb from 6,000 feet at the airport elevation up to 11,000 feet to safely cross these mountains. After a short but demanding and very chilly flight over the mountains, we all made it safely to Panguitch. To summarize the flight, it was 37 miles in an hour and 4 minutes, yielding an average speed of 34 miles an hour and a maximum altitude of 11,320 feet to clear the mountains. I didn't use up my entire fuel bladder, so it's hard to give a real accurate fuel economy, but it was definitely less than 4 liters an hour. As everyone was unpacking and getting their tents set up, we heard a couple motors approaching, and Trevor and Judson happened to land now about an hour behind us at the same airport. Instead of putting up a tent, I decided I would camp out in the pilot lounge, which was small but heated, thankfully. So we rested up until the next morning for a early departure before sunrise. My flight plan for this morning was to complete the third and final leg all the way to our final destination at Cougar Ridge. While not a super long leg in and of itself, I knew I'd be fighting a headwind most of the way through the East Fork River Valley and then have to climb up to cross over a 10,000 foot plateau before coasting down into the final destination. I knew the Nirvana F-Flight had the range, so this really wasn't a particularly challenging flight until I got to the landing. And just as had become a trend with the rest of the Wingman Challenge flights, every single flight I took seemed to be more beautiful than the last. So I'll just share these few views with you. beautiful morning flight. As I approached the LZ, I realized conditions on the ground were going to be pretty squirrely. Winds were 15, gusting approximately 22, and unfortunately the LZ happened to be in the rotor of the buildings in the distance. So I set trims to 6 and active piloted through it and was fortunate to land between wind gusts successfully. And while I, in traditional fashion, missed the landing on my GoPro, the ground crew waiting at the finish line captured these shots of the landing for me. Overall, for this flight, I covered 86.5 miles in 2 hours and 52 minutes with an average speed of 30 miles an hour. I was trimmed out for most of the flight, but because of the headwind, it limited my forward progress considerably. And an average altitude of 8,500 feet peaked out at 10,100 feet when I crossed the plateau, yielding an average fuel economy of 3.8 liters an hour, and I was happy with that given that I was trimmed out for most of the flight. It wasn't a race, but the range of the Nirvana F flight allowed me to do in one flight what everyone else had to do in 2 or more. As such, I was the first to the finish line at the beautiful Cougar Ridge Ranch. This place is hands down the most beautiful place I have ever stayed in my entire life, and I'd be spending the next 36 hours there resting and recuperating before we pressed on to the final leg. While we were waiting for the other pilots to arrive, I went ahead and did some laundry, took a much needed shower, and redressed my legs that at this point definitely needed some fresh bandages. As the other pilots started trickling in later in the afternoon, I went out to the field, watched them land, helped them bag up their wings, and lined up the machines in the hangar for what ended up being a pretty beautiful line of paramotors. Once the rest of the pilots made it in and got freshened up, we all gathered in the kitchen where Becky had put together another fabulous meal for us of croissant sandwiches to close out the end of Leg 2 of the Wingman Challenge. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.